Hello, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for our Eastside Bible reading for the week of June 14th through the 20th, 2020. As we continue through the book of Proverbs, we'll notice that in a book with little context, after all, it is a book of pithy sayings, after all, there are themes that tie certain thoughts together. For example, as we begin this week's reading in Proverbs 16, God is referred to repeatedly in the first several verses of that chapter, and then the thoughts turn to the behavior of the king later on in that chapter. And the idea being that God is the one who prescribes proper behavior, and the king, as the leader of his people, ought to be the one who reflects those behaviors so that his people will see the good in emulating those things. Proverbs, as you know, contains sayings that are sometimes always true, such as in chapter 17, verse 1, better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of feasting with strife. It contains sayings that are generally true, such as chapter 22, verse 6, that tells us we should train up a child in the way that he should go, and even when he's old, he'll not depart from it. And sometimes it contains sayings that are just hard to figure out, like chapter 17, verse 19, that tells us, he who loves transgression loves strife, and he who raises his door seeks destruction. Now, the part about raising one's door is hard to understand. It may have some cultural significance to maybe big doors and how fancy people thought they were and how uppity they might have been in making their doorways bigger. But whether they're always true, generally true, or even hard to understand, there's always something in each and every proverb that has a timeless quality to it that we can apply even today. The fool makes several appearances in the book of Proverbs. We have a concise description of what a fool is in chapter 28, verse 26, as well as advice on how to deal with fools in chapter 26, verses 4 through 5. But some of the best advice is found in Proverbs 28 and in verse 13 that tells us, he who conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion. There are consequences, but there's always hope. I love that about that verse. Psalm 40, as we continue through the Psalms, begins as a song of thanks, but then it turns into a cry for help in faith that God will help the psalmist just as he has always done in times past. Verses 6 through 8 are cited for us in Hebrews chapter 10 and are seen as Christ's fulfillment of that old law's sacrificial system. Psalm 41 is thought to have been written during Absalom's usurpation of David's throne, or at least his attempt to usurp David's throne. And the close friend that we find in verse 9 of Psalm 41 is perhaps Ahithophel, who was one of David's counselors but ended up joining the conspiracy. That passage is used by Jesus in John 13, verse 18, to apply to his own betrayer, of course, whom we know as Judas. Paul quotes from Psalm 117 in Romans chapter 15. Now, Psalm 117 is the shortest in the book, only a couple verses. But what it lacks in length, it makes up for in praise to God. And as I said before, Paul quotes from it in Romans 15, verse 11, as he explains that the gospel is for Jew and Gentile alike. And speaking of Romans, in Romans 15, as we continue our reading there, Paul continues his thoughts that he had begun in Romans chapter 14 as he urges Christians to serve one another just as Christ served all men and served them. He explained that they could do this in practical, tangible, down-to-earth ways. Chapter 16 of the book of Romans is Paul's great sign-off as he personally greets a multitude of people who were doing their best for the cause that they were all in together. And what a great reminder to us that our work is not one that, although we do separately and individually sometimes, we're never alone in the work. As we continue on to that shorter letter of 1 Thessalonians, that first letter to the Thessalonians that Paul wrote acknowledges their good track record. But yet Paul exhorts them to do more, using himself and his fellow workers as examples to them. He related to them of how thrilling it was to receive news of their progress from Timothy, especially regarding how concerned he was, how anxious he was about this fledgling Church of Christ. And again, it's a good reminder to us to do more, better. I hope that you'll get much out of your reading this week in our Eastside Bible reading, and I hope that you're also enjoying these short summaries of the readings. We'll see you next time. God bless you.